In this lecture, we will talk about plants and their relationship to carbon and carbon dioxide, and we will talk about how atmospheric carbon dioxide relates to global temperatures and climate change. So we will start by talking about whether in fact temperatures are warming, and I will show you some evidence suggesting they are. Then we'll talk about the greenhouse effect. We will talk about which kinds of atmospheric gases act as greenhouse gases and which ones don't. We will talk about why we would expect a relationship between atmospheric carbon dioxide and warming temperatures. We'll talk about where carbon and carbon dioxide hangs out within Earth and the atmosphere, so different pools of carbon dioxide. And we'll also talk about how carbon moves around from one pool to another. So this relates to the carbon cycle. Then we will talk about mitigation strategies. So if we were to decide that we wanted to control the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, how could we do that? Next, we'll talk about the relationship between atmospheric carbon dioxide and nutrition. In other words, how much value do we get from the plants that we eat, and how is that influenced by CO2 in the air? We'll talk just a little bit about methane, and I will point you to some important things to get out of your reading. And we'll end by addressing the science of climate change versus the politics of climate change. I will not give you a lecture about what you should do. Instead, I will remind you that what we do is a political decision. Now let's look at some evidence about what's happened to global temperatures over the last 150 or so years. The graph I'm showing you here shows trends over time going from 1880 through the present, and on the y-axis we have the deviation in temperature. So this zero value is a middle value from across the range of time. And then anything above this line means there's been warming relative to that middle value. Anything below the line means cooling. And you can see the entire range here is from 0.8 down to minus 0.6. So that's a range of about 1.4 degrees. But this is Celsius, and the Celsius degree is in the ballpark of 2 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is in the ballpark of 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Now you can also see that year to year there's also a lot of variation. So this isn't the trend towards warming isn't the only thing going on. There's also variation in temperature caused by other things. And scientists have known that, so that's not a huge surprise. But it's worth remembering that there are other factors that affect temperature too. So if we look at the trend, what we can do is sort of plot a line through these points. And we can see across all 4 data sets here. And the 4 different data sets are listed here. They come from European, Japanese, and American scientists. And they all show very much the same trend. Basically what we've seen is maybe some cooling period leading up to around 1900, then a consistent warming period, a leveling off, and a consistent increase with perhaps a spike in the most recent couple of years, although we will have to wait and see whether that spike is an anomaly or whether it continues. But if we were to simplify this down to just one straight line and ignore the small ups and downs, then we can see basically what we're looking at is a consistent increase over this time period. Now let's look at what's happening more locally. So what we see here is the temperatures in Greenville, South Carolina. I think this is actually Greer, South Carolina. From, again, around the 1880s through the present. And I made this graph. I just downloaded the data from the website listed here. This is the government website, it's NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And because weather is important for agriculture, they track temperatures throughout the United States. So again, you can see that there's a fair amount of scatter. You can see this range is going from ballpark of 59 up to ballpark of 64 degrees. So that's about a 4 or 5 degree Fahrenheit range. I fit a polynomial fit through these points that's allowed to have a couple of peaks. And what we can see is a similar trend of an initial warming period, a leveling off, or maybe even a slight cooling, and then from maybe 1970s through present, a trend towards increasing. And so you can make of this data what you will. It hasn't been as obviously of a monotonic increase as it is for the global data, but if you look at this period 1980 through present, then to me at least, it looks like that there's a trend towards warming with a fair amount of variation too. So we saw a pattern of warming. It was somewhat equivocal with the Greenville data, but it was quite strong with the global data. Warming is attributed to the greenhouse effect, and so let's talk about what the greenhouse effect refers to. First, remember that the way that we get energy from the sun is solar radiation, which travels from the sun to Earth in the form of waves. And those waves have different wavelengths, and different wavelengths are associated with different properties. So we have some very high energy, very short wavelengths out here, and ultraviolet is one of those that we're familiar with because when those high energy waves hit us, then they have a tendency to cause skin damage and perhaps cancer. So we're familiar with ultraviolet, but the only wavelengths that we actually see from the sun, the ones that our eyes can detect, are in the visible spectrum. And that's this relatively narrow range here from about 400 to 700 nanometers. And it includes all of the colors of the rainbow you're familiar with, red, orange, yellow, etc. Below that, in other words, with a slightly longer wavelength, we have infrared waves. And infrared has longer waves, and therefore they're associated with a little bit less energy. Now, the important thing here is that if we think about the atmosphere, so we can draw on Earth, and I'm just going to draw some dots to indicate different kinds of gases in the atmosphere. Incoming solar radiation is going to travel through the gases in the atmosphere with minimal interference. And so we're going to have blue sunlight, waves are going to come down, travel through, not be interfered with, and reach the Earth. When they hit the Earth, this is going to cause warming. And this shouldn't be a surprise. If you've ever laid out in the sun, then you felt your body warm up. The same thing is happening here on the Earth's surface, or whatever objects are lying on the Earth's surface. As the Earth's surface warms, much of that energy is going to be released again. And it's going to be released in slightly longer wavelength waves back into the atmosphere. And these are the infrared waves. So it's confusing. I'm drawing infrared and blue. Let's switch and make infrared at least red in color. So there's our infrared going back into the atmosphere. Now, global warming happens because infrared doesn't travel through the atmosphere as well as the incoming wavelengths. When infrared waves leave the Earth and they travel through the atmosphere, some will make it through unscathed and continue out into space. That means that that energy is going to escape the Earth's atmosphere and not cause warming. However, other infrared waves that are released by warmed objects on the Earth's surface are going to run into particles. And some of those particles are going to interact with the infrared waves, and they're going to absorb the energy, and they're going to become heated up. They will eventually release that energy too as waves, Some of those waves might continue out of the atmosphere, but others of those waves are going to get bounced back towards the Earth. And so some of the energy is not escaping into space, but rather it's being retained because of the atmosphere, and it is then contributing to a warmer environment on the surface of the Earth. The overall effect of this then is that the atmosphere traps heat. This is actually a good thing. Without this, we wouldn't have life on Earth. Because the Earth would be inhospitably cold, my understanding is that, in fact, probably all water on the surface of the Earth would be frozen if we had no atmosphere and therefore no greenhouse effect. So if somebody tells you that the greenhouse effect is bad, you can correct them and say that, at least within some range, it's a good thing. However, it's not a good thing necessarily at all levels, because we do like some of the energy to escape back into space. Otherwise, the Earth would become inhospitably hot, which is also not ideal. So, which gas is it in the atmosphere that caused the greenhouse effect? Here's our Earth. It turns out that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is one of the gases that will interact with infrared and stop it from escaping into space. So will methane and water vapor and also ozone. So we have 4 gases that are our primary contributors to the greenhouse effect. Now, luckily for us, neither nitrogen nor oxygen contributes to the greenhouse effect. This is lucky because we have a lot of nitrogen and, to a lesser extent, oxygen in the atmosphere. And so if these two did contribute to the greenhouse effect, then the Earth would be inhospitably hot. With the amount of carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, and ozone that we do have, the temperature is mostly regulated within a range that is hospitable for life. So we've talked about why we would expect a link between atmospheric carbon dioxide and temperature. Let's see what pattern actually occurs. What we're looking at here are 2 sets of data. The first set of data is global carbon dioxide concentrations shown in this blue line, and this is over approximately a 1,000-year period from about the year 1000 through the year 2000. We are also looking at temperature data shown by this red line, and this data is coming at least in part from ice cores. So we dig down into ice at different depths, let's say in the Arctic or Antarctic, and we can look at the amount of carbon dioxide in the bubbles in that ice, and that gives us an idea of how much carbon dioxide was in the air at that time. What we see is that carbon dioxide was fairly flat for most of this time period, but started increasing sometime around 1800 and has been increasing at an accelerating rate over the last 200 plus years. When we look at the temperatures, we see there's more fluctuation. As we've seen before, temperature is influenced by other things besides just carbon dioxide. So it sort of bounces around, but around that period or that time at which carbon dioxide started to go up dramatically, the temperature, with a little bit of lag, also started to increase dramatically. So this suggests that yes, in fact, there is a relationship between carbon dioxide and temperature. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere seems to affect temperature. Let's ask, where does that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere come from? And it turns out there's a few different sources. One source is molten rock, and so this could be things like geysers, but we often think of volcanoes. When volcanoes erupt, carbon dioxide is released. It's also released at other times from vents in the earth. Additionally, life contributes carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. You have already studied the process of respiration, and you should know this equation. When we break down carbohydrates with oxygen, we get two products. One is water, and the other is carbon dioxide. So even as I sit here and breathe, I am releasing some carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But the addition of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere is usually balanced or more than balanced by the process of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and you should be familiar with this. You know the equation that if you take water and you combine it with carbon dioxide, and you happen to be a plant with chloroplasts and chlorophyll, you can combine those together, make glucose, and release oxygen. And so here you can see the carbon dioxide getting taken up. It's getting taken out of the atmosphere. So this is then a decrease of atmospheric carbon dioxide. If the rate of respiration across all organisms exactly equaled the rate of photosynthesis, then the two of them together would lead to no net change in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It turns out that that's not typically what happens. And what we're going to look at here is a budget of carbon in the world in various different places it can be. And we're going to look at how carbon moves from one place to another place. For example, we can see that carbon, which is in the atmosphere here, is taken up by plants as a result of photosynthesis and can be stored in plant biomass. So that occurs, as we just said, because of photosynthesis. And it turns out that the rate of photosynthesis is typically higher than the rate of respiration. What that means is that over time, carbon gets taken out of the atmosphere and gets stored in plant material. Some of it is going to get released because plants do respiration, as do the animals and fungi and other things that eat the plants. Also, when the plant dies, then much of the plant material is going to get respired away by the process of decomposition. So, for example, soil, fungi, and bacteria are going to break down the carbon products like the dead leaves and the dead roots, and most of that carbon is going to get released back into the atmosphere. But when we talked about soil, the fact that as soil develops, we get an accumulation of soil organic matter, which we refer to as humus in the soil. And some of this is very hard for microbes to break down. And as it accumulates, over time, the stuff that remains is virtually impossible for microbes to break down. This means that soil and the organic matter in it can be a long-term storage area for carbon. We can see that on this diagram, and this diagram comes from the US Department of Energy. So, sorry about that. Right here we can see that soil has a really large pool of carbon in it. We've said then already a few places where carbon can exist on the Earth. We have it in the atmosphere. We have it in vegetation, like this tree. And we have a lot of it in the soil. There's a couple of other places where it can occur. Before we move on, let me just specify standing biomass. What we're really referring to is living or dead plant material that hasn't been broken down. So this would be standing biomass right here. In addition to soil, standing biomass in the atmosphere, we also have carbon stored in the ocean. And in fact, if we look over here at the ocean, there's a lot of it. In terms of relative units, there's much more carbon here than in any of the other storage pools. It's in the deep ocean especially, it's also in the surface ocean to a lesser degree. And so this is an important place. Finally, we can see that there's a lot of carbon stored in fossil fuels. This includes coal and oil, as well as some other fossil fuel sources. And so this is going to have been deposited probably back around the Carboniferous period, when plant material was dying at a faster rate than it was being broken down. And so it became buried in the soil, became buried deeper, and eventually got transformed into fossil fuels. And so this was living plant matter at one point, although now it's a long-term storage of carbon. Everything that we've talked about thus far would be pretty much the same whether or not humans were here. So we could think of these as natural processes. Shift gears here and think about anthropogenic effects on carbon pools. Anthropogenic simply means human-related. And there are a few ways that we affect carbon pools. One way is by removing plants, and so we're getting rid of the standing biomass. And if we burn that material, then we are converting that back into atmospheric carbon. So we'd be transferring it in this direction. We also burn fossil fuels, usually to produce energy. And so we can see that here. And this obviously generates electricity or moves our cars. But in the process, we are releasing carbon from the fossil pool back into the atmospheric pool. And we can influence the pools if we reduce soil organic matter. So the way we can do this is oftentimes by things like agriculture. If we take natural vegetation, it often has a lot of organic matter in the soil. However, when we do things like plow fields, we turn that up and get it closer to the surface where it's more available for microbes, there's more oxygen around, and there might be more water around. All of these things can lead the organic matter in the soil then to be more likely to break down and to then get released back into the atmosphere. So that's 3 different ways or so that we can release carbon dioxide: by burning vegetation, burning fossil fuels, and disturbing soil in a way that lets the soil release its carbon back to the atmosphere. So we've talked about the fact that anthropogenic influences could increase carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I showed you one data set that was about 1,000 years long, showing how carbon dioxide has changed over time. Let's look at a narrower window of time where we have finer tuned data. This data set goes from about 1960 to the present, and I believe this was taken in a monitoring station in Hawaii. On the y-axis, we have the carbon dioxide concentration. Notice the graph doesn't start at 0. What we're looking at here is an increase of about 20 to 25% of atmospheric carbon dioxide in this 50 or so year period. So a substantial increase. This goes along with the idea that anthropogenic influences are causing this, because the amount of burning of fossil fuels has increased dramatically during this time period. What I want to do, though, is focus in on the annual variation. So even though there's this general trend towards increase, if you look at it on a finer tuned scale, you should see lots of these little increases and decreases. Each one of those corresponds to 1 year. And on the inset graph at the top left, we can see the annual pattern. On this graph, we still have carbon dioxide on the y-axis and time on the x-axis, but now this is just months in the year. So when we look at this, let's start at what happens sometime around April or May, up here at this very peak. This is when there's the most carbon dioxide in the air out of the entire year. Starting in May, we can see that there is a pattern for that to decrease and decrease and decrease, and it goes down and down and down until around October. And then starting in October, we can see the opposite pattern. Carbon dioxide increases again through November and December, and through the winter months, and even into the spring until we finally get back to around March or April. So why is this? Well, to think about that, First, remember that most land in the world is in the northern hemisphere. Then remember that in the northern hemisphere, the time when trees have their leaves is this period in the spring, going from somewhere around April through somewhere around October, depending on where exactly you are. Then think about the fact that most deciduous trees are going to drop their leaves sometime around October, and those leaves are going to be on the forest floor breaking down for the rest of the autumn and through the winter. So basically what we're seeing here is that during the period when trees are doing photosynthesis more than respiration and they're adding new growth, the amount of carbon dioxide decreases. Then during the period when trees are doing very little photosynthesis and their leaves are getting broken down and getting respired back into carbon dioxide, then the amount of carbon dioxide increases. So this is good evidence that, in fact, plants have a substantial influence on carbon dioxide concentrations. We've now talked about where carbon dioxide is stored, how carbon dioxide naturally moves and moves due to anthropogenic forces from one pool to another. With that in mind, we can think about ways that we could mitigate carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In other words, how can we slow its rise or, in theory, reduce the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide? There's some fairly straightforward strategies that are suggested by what we've talked about. First, we can avoid additional CO2 releases by minimizing the amount of woody biomass that gets burned or otherwise cut down and allowed to decompose. So if we have a forest, then that forest is storing carbon dioxide. If we remove that forest, then that carbon dioxide will likely be released back to the atmosphere. Along these lines, if we added new forest or new vegetation, then that could store even more carbon dioxide. Additionally, this is thought about less, but I think is at least as important. It's important that we maintain processes that contribute organic matter to the soil rather than removing it from the soil. And so there's agricultural ways we can do this. One is by doing no-till agriculture, which has a variety of other benefits and I think is increasingly important in commercial agriculture. A second way we can do this is by thinking about what we do with the leftover remains on agricultural fields. Do we burn it? Like, do we burn the corn stalks that are left over? Or do we collect it and try to figure out other ways that we can slow the carbon release? An idea that's gotten a lot of press but is challenging is to increase the ocean's uptake of carbon dioxide. So remember that we do have phytoplankton doing photosynthesis in the ocean, and they capture carbon dioxide. So if there was a way to increase the amount of phytoplankton, then perhaps we could increase this movement of CO2 from the atmosphere into the oceans. There's practical limitations that make this difficult, and your reading discusses some of those. We are going to switch gears a bit and talk about the effect of atmospheric carbon dioxide on plant growth. Before we talk about what happens, I wanted to show you how is this studied. And so in various regions around the US and presumably around the world, we have these carbon dioxide augmentation areas. And so you see these posts here in the diagram. These are connected to pipes that are connected to carbon dioxide tanks. And those tanks are regulated so researchers can effectively release carbon dioxide over an area to increase the concentration. And they can do this in replicates. So you see another setup back here and more setups back further into the background. And so we can see, for example, what is the effect of increased carbon dioxide on agricultural production and agricultural quality. And this has been done in a variety of ecosystem types, ranging from pine forests to agricultural fields to grasslands. And so we can see our effects similar or different in these different environments. Atmospheric carbon dioxide has the potential to have large effects on plant growth because atmospheric carbon dioxide is one of the important ingredients for photosynthesis. So one idea is that if we have more CO2 in the atmosphere, the carbon dioxide will act as fertilizer. It's basically giving more of a nutrient to the plants, and so the plants should be able to grow more. If this was true, then as carbon dioxide increased in the atmosphere, the plant growth could compensate for it and thereby reduce the accumulation of CO2, or in other words, we could keep CO2 levels relatively stable as a result. And this works to some extent in some environments. The problem is that plants are thought to be limited by some limiting nutrients. You can imagine that some plants have their growth limited by a lack of carbon dioxide. When that's true, then the CO2 fertilization works well. The problem is that other plants in other environments are limited by other nutrients. For example, plants are often limited by the amount of nitrogen available. And sometimes they're limited by the amount of phosphorus available. And so if one of these other nutrients is limiting growth, then adding more carbon dioxide would not have a substantial effect on the rate of photosynthesis and the amount of material that the plants accumulate. So CO2 fertilization helps, but it does not completely answer the problem of CO2 release. It is important, though, from a nutritional standpoint. If we think about a plant that has more carbon dioxide available, then it's going to be able to do more photosynthesis. If it succeeds in doing more photosynthesis, but it doesn't have more nitrogen, or it doesn't have adequate phosphorus, or some other nutrients, maybe sulfur, for example, then these other nutrients can limit the amount of protein that the plants make. So the plant can do more photosynthesis, but can't make a lot more protein. The result of this is that carbohydrates will be relatively cheap and easy to make, proteins will be expensive to make, and the ratio of carbohydrates to protein will increase. So in other words, the plants will have more carbs and less protein. At least less protein per unit volume of food. We can see this effect. So people have done experiments in agricultural settings like the one I showed you and measured the amount of protein in the resulting food. And what we can see is that if we have the amount of carbon dioxide that was in the atmosphere around the year 1900, then flour we'd get, so this is wheat flour, had about 19% protein in it. With our 2008 levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so carbon dioxide has gone up, then the protein content has gone down, and we're at around 18.5%. We can also project out, if our projections are correct, that the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is going to go up to around 715 parts per million sometime in the second half of this century, and the same relationship holds, we would expect the protein content in our flour to further decrease down to around 17.5%. This can be important for human nutrition because in many populations, the amount of calories are not limiting. So in other words, we don't just need more carbs, but what is limiting to our health is protein and other nutrients. So what we want to maintain healthy populations would be flour that was high in protein, and this downward trend would mean that we would have to eat more carbs to get the same amount of protein, but if we eat more carbs, then that can lead to nutritional problems, for example, obesity or diabetes. So overall, the effect of increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is a problem for the nutrition of our food. A piece of evidence for this. This graph is showing the same thing. If we increase carbon dioxide concentrations, then how does the relative amount of different nutrients change in the plant material? And this was done from across a range of plant types, and it's being averaged together here. On the y-axis, we can see 0 right here. Anything above this means there's an increase. Anything below this means there's a decrease. So in environments that have artificially high carbon dioxide, mimicking what's expected to happen later in the century, the amount of carbon in that food material increases. That makes sense, right? More carbon in the atmosphere, more carbon in the food. But look at what happens to the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, sulfur, magnesium, iron, etc. They all go down from about 7% for calcium and down about 15% for nitrogen. And nitrogen is tightly linked to protein. So that's roughly equivalent to a 15% decrease in the protein in our food. And if you look at protein specifically for a variety of crops, we can see for things like barley, rice, wheat, soybean, and potato, there's a large decrease in the amount of protein. The exception here is soybean, and you should be able to figure out why this exception occurs. To think about that, go back and think about what we said about symbiosis. And what kind of symbiosis do legumes have? So soybean is a legume. And I'll clue you in. Think about nitrogen-fixing bacteria and the fact that soy plants can use the extra carbon dioxide, make extra sugars, feed that to nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and those bacteria then can make more nitrogen available. And so these other plants that can't do this trick are more limited. Soybean is less limited. So we've already said most of what's on this slide. This is just a reminder about how fertilization works. So carbon dioxide is required for photosynthesis. If we have more of it, we can increase plant growth rates, but this only works when carbon dioxide is limiting to growth rates. I'm going to move. The other important greenhouse gas that we would worry about is methane. And methane is CH4, it kind of looks like this, at least in 2 dimensions. And it's important because it's a very potent greenhouse gas. Your reading talks about this, and so I'm not going to go over it, but some things that you should be able to explain. First, in what way is methane more of a problem than carbon dioxide in terms of warming of the atmosphere? And then conversely, in what way is methane less of a problem? Third, you should be able to explain what are important sources of methane. And fourth, how can we control methane? Your reading talks about how specifically we control methane release from landfills. So we've talked a bunch about how carbon dioxide concentrations are changing and how this could lead to climate change. I want to come back around now to whether or not this matters. This could be important for a variety of reasons. Warming temperatures are going to lead to melting ice, and melting ice is going to lead to rising sea levels. We've already seen evidence in an earlier lab that in fact sea levels have risen. And we can see, let's hit these other things and then we'll look at the graph. In addition to rising sea levels, we can have the spread of infectious disease increased, for example, because mosquitoes that carry parasites have a more northerly range as the climate gets warmer. We can see effects on agricultural production because temperatures changes will lead to some crops being able to grow better and some crops being able to grow worse. Additionally, the change in temperature will come with changes in precipitation patterns, and so water will become more limiting in some areas, and potentially less limiting elsewhere. And we've already looked at the effects of carbon dioxide on the nutrition of food. Additionally, as we have a warmer atmosphere, that literally means there's more energy in the atmosphere. More energy in the atmosphere would be expected to correlate with more or larger storms, so possibly more hurricanes or more tornadoes, for example. Now let's go back and look at sea level. So I've said that we've already seen sea level rise, and this graph shows mean sea levels relative to 1992 levels on the y-axis across years, starting around 1900 through the present being about right here. And what we can see is a slow, gradual rise in sea levels up through the present time. Then everything after the present time is projections of what we expect sea levels to do if there's a small amount of climate change, if there's a moderate amount, or if there's a large amount. So our intermediate projections are sea levels rising another more than a meter, about 1.2 meters. The highest expected projections would be going up about 2 meters, and the best possible outcome would be going up only about half a meter. What would be the effect of this if it did happen? This map shows areas that are within 1 meter of sea level now. And so anything in red is within 1 meter, and thereby a 1 meter increase would be expected to inundate those areas. And you can see there's a large portion of the coast of eastern North America that would be affected. And there's some major metropolitan areas, especially Miami and Virginia Beach, and maybe Jacksonville here, that would also be substantially impacted. On the Gulf, you can see that New Orleans would be hugely impacted. If we had a worst case scenario and a dramatic rise, let's say 6 meters, then everything in yellow would be expected to be inundated, and that's a dramatically larger area. I am going to end by addressing the political versus the scientific debate about climate change. And until the past several years, this really was not a political issue at all. And it's only become political, as I said, within that time period. So this is, of course, a science class. And so what we're focusing on here is the science of climate change, especially as it relates to botany. And so within the scientific community, there's a high degree of certainty that climate change is occurring, and also that anthropogenic release of carbon sources, as well as methane, are substantial contributors to climate change. And so within the hypothesis testing and sort of data collection framework of science, this is not at this point debated. Also, science and engineering together can be used to suggest responses to mitigate effects. So for example, we could put models together that estimate how different agricultural practices or different levels of forest protection might change the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and also the amount of warming that results. So what I would suggest is that science has the tools that are best able to answer these questions. Is it occurring? How much do humans contribute to it? And what are possible approaches that could be used to respond? I would emphasize, however, that it's very much a political question as to whether we want to respond, and if we do respond, do we want to do it by trying to figure out how to adapt to increasing temperatures and sea levels, or do we want to respond by trying to mitigate the increase in temperatures and sea levels, or do we want to just ignore it and let the process happen and deal with it when it arrives? We probably all have different opinions about how much of society's resources should be devoted to solving the problem, if any at all, and that is beyond the scope of this class. So if you think it's super important and you want to stop using fossil fuels, then that's great. And if you think it's totally unimportant and you want to keep driving a fuel efficient car, that's equally great, because that's a values question. That's not a scientific question. What I want you to know for the purposes of this course and this lecture are the relationships between greenhouse gases and how they're expected to influence temperature. The evidence that greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, has increased, and the evidence about whether or not temperatures have changed as a result.